Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Agata Duda-Płonka, and I'm the head of the Human Rights and Promotion of Democracy section in the UN and Human Rights Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Poland. On behalf of the Ministry, I would like to welcome each and every one of you distinguished guests to the 9th edition of the Warsaw Dialogue for Democracy. The theme of this year's edition is Resilience of Democracy in the times of COVID-19. And without the further ado, I'm declaring the conference open, and I would like to give the floor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Poland, Professor Zbigniew Rau.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor to welcome you in Warsaw. I'm delighted that after a break due to the COVID-19, once again we can have a dialogue on democracy. Since 2012, the Warsaw Dialogue for Democracy always gathered human rights defenders, activists, and civil society from around the world. We hope that this year we will be able to reach the same audience virtually. We aim to explore potential threats, challenges, and opportunities related to democracy and respect for human rights which stem from the pandemic. We will take a closer look at efforts of states, international organizations, and civil society to build a resilience of democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, to set up today's discussion, let me underline 3 issues that Poland finds important to build more resilient democracies. Firstly, cooperation. Close and continued cooperation of all stakeholders is crucial for safeguarding basic freedoms. It would not be possible to address common problems effectively without the involvement of leaders and communities in sincere dialogue and cooperation. Secondly, education. It's a key determinant of emergence and sustainability of democracy. It promotes political participation at the individual level and fosters a collective sense of civic duty. Last but not least, inclusiveness. All parts of society have to be included in the decision-making process. Active participation of citizens helps democracy to stay alive. Only strong and diverse civil society has the ability to prevent regression in the quality of democratic institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that the Warsaw Dialogue for Democracy will once again provide a platform to exchange good practices and new ideas on how to advance the democratic cause globally. Let me express my recognition to your engagement in promoting and protecting democratic values. It is indeed much noticed in the international community. I wish you a vigorous and fruitful discussion.
Ladies and gentlemen, and now I would like to invite you to listen to the first panel discussion about the role of countries and organizations in building back better. During the discussion moderated by Mr. Thomas Garrett, Secretary General of the Community of Democracies, we will focus on experiences of Sweden, Republic of Korea, and Argentina. And with this, I would like to give the floor to the Secretary General. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, distinguished ambassadors, dear participants. It's my pleasure to represent the community of democracies again at the Warsaw Dialogue for Democracy. Let me express my appreciation to the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, His Excellency Mr. Zbigniew Rau, for organizing this event. This event, since 2012, has brought together civil society activists academics, experts, and government representatives from around the world to discuss ways of promoting democracy and fundamental freedoms. I'm glad we're doing so again today on Human Rights Day. So let me welcome our speakers. We will be hearing from Her Excellency, Mrs. Ana Maria Ramirez, Ambassador of the Argentine Republic, Her Excellency Ms. Miro Son, Ambassador of the Republic of Korea, and His Excellency Mr. Stefan Goldberg, Ambassador of the Kingdom of Sweden. It's a pleasure to me to see so many member states of the community of democracies represented here today. As mentioned, this year the organizers have chosen a very timely theme, resilience of democracy in a time of COVID-19. During our discussion today, we hope to explore themes related to the potential threats, challenges, and opportunities regarding the impact of COVID-19 and this pandemic on democracy and recovery, especially how it affects civil society and human rights. Our panel is going to focus on the role of countries and organizations in building resilience during this very demanding time. We hope to serve as a platform to have a conversation based on different experiences about the threats, the challenges, but also the opportunities regarding the impact of the pandemic on democracy, and how the post-pandemic recovery, which we hope to enter soon, affects democratic states with a focus on identifying and sharing best practices that will stimulate further reflection and action. If I might just say a few words before we hear from our esteemed panel. We define democratic resilience as the persistence of democratic institutions and practices. But it must be noted that democracy's resilience in many countries is fragile. And so we must be constantly aware of how civil liberties and democratic institutions can be impacted in unexpected ways by a state's action. COVID-19 provided an unprecedented threat to public health and governments around the world, both offline and online. They may have undermined the engagement of civil society and a general backsliding of democratic progress globally. To help democracies mitigate these dangers, there exists a special role for civil society as watchdogs of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Collaboration between governments and civil society is going to be essential to recovery from the health, economic, social, and humanitarian crisis. Civil society organizations play a vital role in raising awareness, sharing information, informing responses, advocating for democracy and human rights, and holding governments accountable. So as the COVID-19 pandemic continues to impact the international system, the international community should respond to the global crisis as a window of opportunity for adaptability and innovation, which are key attributes of resilience at the levels of individuals, society, and institutions. And so with that, I'm very pleased to turn to our esteemed panel, and I'm going to begin the discussion by asking each of our ambassadors to speak about the role of civil society and their country's response to the pandemic. And we'll begin with His Excellency, the Ambassador of Sweden. Sir.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, and thank you to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for inviting me to take part in this discussion, in this important event. I'm glad that we can again hold it according to tradition, and that we can use the opportunities of using technology to reach a wider audience, perhaps, than before. Let me start by offering a few general observations on the topic of democracy and the pandemic before I say a few words about how we have tried to deal with this challenge in my own country. The way I see it, the pandemic has raised the critical issue of how to strike the right balance between, on the one hand, provide for public health and security for people on the one hand, and on the other hand, maintain as much as possible of the normality that we all expect as citizens. And that normality certainly includes the civil liberties, the rights that we enjoy as citizens of democracies, and so on. And I think we have all, when we have tried to address the challenge of the pandemic, found that this is not so easy. It is a fine balance to strike, because public authorities, governments and parliaments have a wide responsibility, which includes both the guarantees ensured by constitutions, ultimately by international law, on civil liberties, human rights, democratic principles, but also to ensure that the people feel safe and is safe. And I think the way we have tried to do this in democracies is very much based on what you mentioned, Mr. Secretary General, also in your remarks, the fact that the ultimate remedy is, of course, that we can hold our leaders to account. That is, if the citizens feel that the measures imposed are not in accordance with what they should be, there is always the opportunity at elections to change the leaders. And this goes to two elements which I think are of crucial importance. Also in the sense to what extent the measures imposed have been effective, namely whether they have been viewed as legitimate and credible. Legitimate in the sense that they have been issued or decided by or imposed by authorities which are deemed to have the legitimacy to impose such restrictions. And to what extent they are credible, that is a very important factor to decide whether people will observe them or not. If the restrictions are not viewed as credible, then they will be ignored. And then, for obvious reasons, the restrictions will not be as effective as they could have been or should have been. So the way we have tried to deal with this in my own country also takes into account the specifics of Sweden and the way Swedish society works. We have a long tradition of maintaining a separation of the political power and the public authorities. It is a tradition that goes back hundreds of years, and it means, for example, that public authorities are not part of the political structure. The heads of public authorities are appointed by the government, but they are not changed when there is a change of government. And public officials have a very large degree of independence. The government is prohibited to interfere in individual cases of application of law, especially when it comes to application of law in relation to individuals. So neither parliament nor government, and certainly not individual ministers, can decide how a public official applies the law in an individual case. This results in a kind of a decentralized government, but it also is both a reflection of and, in a way, a guarantee for public trust in the public authorities. And this has become very apparent in the way we have dealt also with the pandemic, because although legislation obviously have been adopted by parliament and government, decisions have been taken, much of the practical implementation of our strategy to deal with the pandemic has been the responsibility of public officials who are not political. They are, of course, accountable to the public through law, but also local and regional authorities included. And so that is one factor. Another factor which I think has been in a way specific to Sweden is that most of the strategy has been implemented through recommendations. That is not restrictions which have been mandatory by law to observe. There is a debate also in Sweden to what extent this has been efficient or not. We, of course, have not, and we do not claim to have found the perfect way of dealing with the pandemic, but we can note that the trust in the public authorities is still very high, despite the fact that we now have almost 2 years of the pandemic, and that most people actually do observe the recommendations issued by the public authorities. It is true that government has been given the right by law, by parliament, to impose certain restrictions. That is, legislation has been adopted as a result of the pandemic, which to an extent can be said to infringe on the freedoms that one enjoys as a citizen. But that legislation has been adopted and implemented according to a general principle of proportionality. That is, restrictions should not be more than absolutely necessary to ensure public health and the efficient working of society, and also public health in a more general sense. That is, certain restrictions may be good to deal with the pandemic, but they might have negative side effects for public health in general, and those side effects may be worse than the actual effects of the pandemic. So the principle of proportionality has been at the basis of the restrictions that have been imposed, and also of the recommendations that have been issued by the public authorities. It is also part of this principle of proportionality that any restriction should be temporary. That is, during the pandemic, it would not be acceptable, and it's not going to be acceptable, that restrictions imposed to deal with the pandemic would be of a permanent nature, that they would permanently limit the exercise of fundamental freedoms. Parliament has adopted legislation to give the government certain authority within specific areas to exercise its right of imposed restrictions. For example, the number of people that can assemble, the number of people that can attend public gatherings, for example, the number of people that can go to a restaurant and so on. But this legislation has also been temporary in nature. It was adopted earlier this year and it has already expired. It is, of course, possible for Parliament to again adopt similar legislation, but it was said very clearly from the start that this is going to be a temporary legislation only for the benefit of dealing with the acute phase of the pandemic. A factor also at the bottom of our strategy has been that it is not possible, according to the Swedish constitution, to impose or introduce a state of emergency in peacetime. We do not have this provision. There is, of course, a debate now in Sweden whether we should change the constitution to that extent, because the pandemic has shown that there might be occasions when Parliament and government need to be having this possibility or this authority. But the fact that we don't have it, I think, is also a reflection on the fact that we did not think that we needed it. Of course, this is the first pandemic in 100 years. I think all of us will draw conclusions from it. But the basic principles underlying our strategy, that is strong trust in public authorities, the principle of proportionality, and the ultimate remedy of holding political representatives to account in elections, that I think has shown the specifics of Sweden, but also the strengths of democracies. That is one of the absolute strengths of democracies, one of many, that we can hold our leaders to account. I think I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for those insightful comments. And now I would invite the Ambassador of Argentina, Ambassador Ramirez, to present her remarks.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to be here at the Human Rights Day. And on behalf of the Embassy of Argentina, I would like to express our gratitude for this invitation and to the Minister of Foreign Affairs for his welcome remarks. For us, it's a happy coincidence that we are holding this debate on the same day that we celebrate a new anniversary of the recovery of the democracy. 38 years ago, on the 10th of December of 1983, Dr. Raúl Alfonsín assumed as President of the Republic, and he was the one who successfully led the country in a very difficult period. Today, the international community is facing a challenge created by a simple virus. Now we know how we can protect ourselves, how to protect our families, our communities, our societies. But when the virus first appeared, the impact on the people and on the economy in many cases were devastated. Now, in the middle of a new wave, we are dealing with its consequence. At the beginning of 2020, the government of Argentina reacted quickly to improve the national health systems and to take early decisions regarding public health, including closures of borders, business activities, schools, and universities. On March 19, a lockdown was implemented to reduce the impact of the COVID. At the same time, other measures were adopted in order to increase social protection to mitigate the social-economic impact. For instance, social programs were expanded to help the most vulnerable people and to prevent social tensions. Special attention was given to women because most of the burden was in her hands. Women have 33% of the jobs in the economy, and also they care about children care and elderly care is in her hands. The Argentinian government followed very strictly the recommendations given by regional and international organizations and other institutions regarding the need to respect international standards of human rights to implement those policies. The Argentinian population was highly engaged to comply with this initial public policy. A survey made by UNICEF last year showed that 60% of the households consider the quarantine prevents the expansion of the COVID. And months later, the percentage was still high. At the beginning of the lockdown, the engagement was 96%. Communication with the public was essential. President Fernandez made periodic announcements to inform the public in advance about forthcoming measures. For the government, the national production of critical supplies was a priority and managed to double the production capacity of mechanical respirators, reconverting part of the textile industry to increase the production of masks and other elements of protection, and the promotion of national development for COVID treatment. With the collaboration of the World Health Organization and the coordination between national and provincial authorities working together with local government, we are a federal country. In a very short time, the country increased the capacity of the health system. I have to say that COVID reached Argentina at a time of economic difficulties. Within this framework, policies implemented were oriented to stimulate the economy and to protect jobs. The most significant programs were ATP, Emergency Assistance Program for Work and Production, and IFE, Emergency Family Income, which reached 8 million employment workers, informal and domestic workers, and small contributors. Recently, the World Bank approved a loan, $500 million, to strengthen government efforts to contain the COVID pandemic. This financing operation will allow continue advancing the vaccination plan. That is a central element for the economic and social recovery of the Argentina. According to our National Minister of Health, Dr. Carla Bisotti, the vaccination strategy has proven to be one of the effective tools to protect the Argentinian population. Regarding the vaccination program, the government concludes several agreements to buy vaccines, and then we provide vaccines with Sputnik, AstraZeneca, Covishield, Sinopharm, Pfizer, Moderna, CanSino. The government maintained negotiations with other companies and with Cuban authorities regarding the vaccine Soberana and Abdala. Since the beginning of the current year, the Maxine's laboratory from Argentina, in partnership with a Mexican company, began the production of AstraZeneca. Another Argentinian laboratory, Richmond, is part of the production process of the Sputnik, developed by Gamaleya Institute and the Russian Federation. Last September, the Pan American Health Organization announced that 2 centers in Argentina and Brazil will develop and manufacture vaccines with messenger RNA technology for Latin American and the Caribbean region. This initiative seeks to reduce the region's dependence on important supplies. As many other threats to peace, security, development, the pandemic situation is a global challenge that requires solidarity and the strengthening of the international cooperation. In this context, the government of Argentina delivered donation of vaccine to several countries in our regions, Barbados, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Dominique and Grenada, and also to Vietnam, Mozambique and Angola. President Fernandez recently said that the world is already seeing a speedy recovery, which implies that once again, many will be left behind. If we want to avoid the catastrophic consequence that this gap will generate in a post-pandemic world, we must work to build a new multilateralism oriented toward the development of the most vulnerable countries. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Excellency. And I would now like to invite the Ambassador of the Republic of Korea, Her Excellency Ms. Mira Sun, to present remarks. Ambassador.
Thank you. It gives me an immense pleasure, and also it's an immense pleasure, but also a privilege for me to participate in this dialogue today, because I do remember in my first year as an ambassador, this dialogue was a big marketplace of all the innovative ideas of democracy. And we are, today we are down to 3 of us and the moderator, but I'm sure this is only the very beginning of our gradual return to the life with a full democracy. And also this is a very meaningful chance for me to say goodbye to Warsaw, and because tomorrow I'm leaving, and this will be my last official appearance, even though online. So I just wanted to say all of my friends and colleagues and that I have, who have made my life really very, enriched my life, and also helped me survive as an ambassador. So a farewell to everyone. Our country was, at the very beginning of the pandemic, well, we were hit much earlier than most of the rest of the world. We had the first patient before the end of January of 2020, and by the middle of February, the number was reaching very worrying statistics. But by the end of February, the number already began to go down. And here, every country had different experiences. For our country, it was democracy and democratic institutions and democratic values that really helped us, well, more or less rescued from a pitfall, because our embrace of COVID-19 was to go transparent and open, because we had to have, of course, certain measures, but what the government decided to do was to open all the government knows and does not know even, to be honest about it. And if the government, because we were all doing this for the first time, not just the government, but the civic society. So when the government could not find a solution, we went to the civil society saying that we have tried this and it did not work. So we went for collective wisdom. And that always helped, because at the very beginning of the pandemic, it was our public that even junior high school students were developing apps, different apps, how to help people stay healthy and to be aware of what is going around. And one of the apps developed by a junior high school kid, he was getting already hundreds and thousands of hits in the first couple of weeks. And he also opened it for free, not for charging any fees. But another one example is of how resilient democracy can really help any challenge was that when at the very beginning, because our numbers were going to thousands per day, we had a problem with mask supplies. Even though we still had manufacturing capacity, very fortunate, because like Poland, we were manufacturing masks on our own. On the other hand, people were hoarding masks and monopolizing the supplies, and it was impossible with that chaotic state when everybody was trying to grab whatever information and whatever resources they had. So we tried everything, it didn't work. So we went to the public, and it was a medical community and pharmaceutical community. They came up with a solution that we already have substance abuse prevention programs. So different, for instance, like opioid or prescription painkillers. For that, we already have a system that different pharmacists would have to take the note, how many people were buying how many drugs, how many pills per day or per week. And there was already a system. So we plugged in masks, even though it was not controlled substance, and it worked right then and there. And within 1 week, when people finally understood and felt that masks would be ready when they needed them, people will no longer buy them hundreds and thousands for the entire family. So that also helped us, the government helped with, it's usually the disinformation, but also lack of information that causes people to panic. And once you control that fear and panic factors, then you can really start implementing more science and data-based policies. So, and effectiveness of democracies in the fight against COVID and the potential, and there was also another big concern of potential misuse of digital technology as tools of mass surveillance. This only came toward much later than at the very beginning. But three major areas of challenges to democracy during this time of pandemic was free flow of information, freedom of movement, and free elections. Because we had national parliamentary election in April. The numbers were already going down, but Korea was the first country that had a nationwide election at the very beginning of the pandemic. And our embassy was one of the very few embassies throughout the whole world of our government that not only conducted election, people traveled. We had our residents coming, our citizens driving from Wrocław and Katowice all day just to vote, and because it was all by reservation only. And we had to also issue certain safety instructions for our we had very detailed safety guidelines, but also we had to communicate that to our citizens. And they drove 5 hours, 4 hours, voted for 15 minutes, and then drove back because they couldn't stay at the hotels. But they were so happy that they could exercise their votes. And to our surprise, we had the highest ever voting rate in 3 decades during this national election, because people realized that your vote counts, and having an accountable government in place at the time of pandemic and having a workable democracy makes life and death difference. So in this sense, the beginning of a pandemic and even up to this date, pandemic taught us to appreciate democracy once again, and why democratic institutions and democracy is so crucial for any sustainable society and any sustainable economy even. And luckily, our economic downturn was also reverted pretty quickly because we could control, I'm not saying we, the government only, but the civic society, a partnership of civic society and the government helped control the pandemic throughout the whole. Well, our numbers are getting a bit worrisome now, but still, the total aggregate number of patients for the last almost 2 years is about 500,000. In a country of 51 million, that's still less than 10%. Well, less than 1% even. And the number of fatalities, death, we are still not even 0.1% yet. We just passed 40,000, and that number is very worrisome. But again, even when you say a country of 51 million, the number may not be very big. But for every family who has lost someone to COVID-19, or who had family members who suffered greatly because of COVID-19, for them, one person, one death, or one new patient is as critical as all the other numbers. And it has affected our lives permanently and fundamentally. So for freedom of information, I just mentioned that sharing with and fully disclosing to the public all information known to and actions taken by the government about the coronavirus, while strictly complying with the protection of personal data by law. We were fortunate in a sense that we had MERS and SARS before coronavirus. And as we had suffered, particularly SARS was very fatal. Even the number of fatality was very small. It was deadly contagious. And as we went through those small cycles of pandemics, we had long discussions, public discussions, how we can balance personal data protection and public safety. And we had different laws already in place when coronavirus hit us. And we had 3 different laws about balancing democracy, freedom versus public health and collective welfare. Those laws went through so many amendments. Every time we have a new development, the parliament will take it to their task how to amend the law and readjust ourselves. So we were lucky that we had a legal framework, but we were also lucky that the parliament could also do balance and check as the government goes along. So everything was under the rule of law, and again, even the pandemic and whatever actions the government takes should be and governed by rule of law. And when it comes to freedom of movement, until fairly recently, we managed to keep society open without any lockdowns or closing the border. Unfortunately, with the Delta variant, we reversed that action. But still, we never closed the border. It is just a quarantine, and non-essential business, non-essential travels are now prohibited. So we have had students still coming to study in Korea and from Poland and Lithuania, two countries that I cover as ambassador. But also we have business people traveling from Poland, and also even for international athletic events. It's just that a non-essential travels, tourism is something we cannot afford for safety of not only our public, but for our visitors' safety as well. And we're hoping to keep it that way. And the last important portion is free elections, of course. Elections and democratic institutions is critical to keep the society as free as we can get. So, and then about the last part of IT infrastructure, again, technology can be only good or bad by the people who use it in a good or bad ways. So for us, technology was helping us control the pandemic, not to control the government's, not to enforce or enhance government's control of the public life. So this is, again, technology is only the means. It's not evil or it's not good by itself, but it's really the people's will and the democratically elected representatives how to control that technology to serve the public, not to harm the public. So with that, because this was also, Korea is very developed in terms of ICT, information and communication technologies. And this is also where our government had to be extra careful, because just one attempt or one even misstep can do a permanent damage to democratic institutions. And hopefully when, again, our country had also made mistakes and we didn't do everything perfect, but at least with those errors, trials and errors and mistakes, and sometimes very bad mistakes, at least to be open and transparent about it, you gain the trust of the public. And without any trust from the public, even the most effective and the best policies are destined to fail. So for us, openness and transparency was ultimately about trust in the system, trust in the government, but ultimately trust in ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Sun, for your presentation, and we also want to thank you for joining us today on this, your last day in Warsaw. And I know that the diplomatic community is going to miss you and wish you the best as you move on to the next endeavors of your life. We've had three very interesting presentations from three democracies from three very different regions of the world, in which we've looked at the idea of the performance of democracies facing a challenge such as the pandemic. I suppose a question I would like to pose perhaps to each of our panelists is, now that we're 2 years into this pandemic, we have, as Ambassador Sun mentioned, some trial and error. We have attempted to do things. We've seen democracies attempt to do things to protect their citizens. Do you remain convinced that democracies are more effective in responding to such a challenge than, say, a more authoritarian country? We hear this debate out there that perhaps authoritarian nations have been able to force more effective responses. I don't know if anyone would like to speak to that. Perhaps Ambassador Gulgray, would you be interested in responding to that? And perhaps each of you will.
I hope it will not come as a surprise that I do think that democracies are better also in this sense in dealing with challenges facing countries and peoples. I'll come back to what I said in my initial remarks about the factors of legitimacy and credibility. It is my firm conviction that democracies, by and large, can provide more legitimacy than authoritarian regimes, for the simple fact that if they are not viewed as legitimate, they will be changed by the people in elections. There will always be alternatives to those in government, those in parliament, those who take decisions on our behalf. One of the many weaknesses of authoritarian regimes is that if you don't like their policies, there is nothing you can do as a citizen or a subject. Whereas in democracies, we can. And we also, in democracies, have an open debate about the important issues for people. And the right of individuals to exercise their freedom of speech, their right to have access to information, the right to assemble, to express their views, also when they are critical of those in power. And this also goes to the factor of credibility. That is, any restrictions which are not viewed as credible will not be observed, even if they are imposed by a very authoritarian regime. Because not even very authoritarian regimes can ultimately control the behavior of every individual at every moment. And I think if we look around the world at the way the pandemic has been dealt with and the success of dealing with the pandemic, everything from the number of fatalities to the level of vaccinations to the way societies have been able to function. Because let's remember, there is no simple solution to dealing with the pandemic. You can't shut down society. Society needs to function. Certain functions in society simply have to be working. Someone has to deal with garbage disposal. Someone has to deal with transportation, logistics. Someone has to work in the health sector, and so on. Society needs to work. And there is, in my view, a much better prospect for functioning societies in democracies than in authoritarian regimes. So my personal opinion is that I'm absolutely not convinced that authoritarian rule is in any way to be preferred, even in a situation that we have endured during the last 2 years of a pandemic. I think that when we do the accounts after this, make the accounts after this pandemic, I feel fairly certain, even very certain, that we can conclude that democracies we have passed the test. We have nothing to be ashamed of. And to the extent that there have been mistakes, if they haven't been recognized, they will be recognized. Ultimately, those who took the decisions will have to answer for them on the election day. And that is, as I said, one of the many strengths of democracies, that we can hold those who represent us to account, and if we don't like them, we can vote for someone else.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Ramirez, would you like to speak to that question?
I absolutely convinced that only in democracy you can face this challenge. And the democracy can resist. Only democracy has all the instruments that the state needs to comply and to face this new situation. Ambassador of Korea said that his country was one of the first hit by the virus. And we have, in Argentina, we have, the first case was in March. We have time to look to different experience. And the result is that you have to adapt for this limited time extraordinary measures. And how the state can impose that? Because of the trust of the society. And this trust is given by the democracy, because you have trust in your authorities and you have time to decide if all the instruments that they have at the time was the right one or not. If you are not agree, the democracy gives you a very instruments, a very strong instruments, and that's the election. With election, you have to decide, and for the authority probably will be a test. But I'm not. That is the politician feels. Normally, always they say as a test. But personally, I think that the go to election is just to decide the next authorities, regardless of what they did in the past or what they do in the present. You go to the election convinced that you have, it's the moment that you decide which chance to give to any particular party. But I said at the beginning, only the democracy provides the instruments to face these enormous challenges for a limited time, according to the circumstances and according to what the society needs.
Thank you very much. And Ambassador Sun, you did refer to this somewhat, but would you like to expand a bit?
I absolutely agree with what Stefan said, that in authoritarian society, you don't have a choice anyway. But in a democratic society, well, we have this axiom that the last safeguard of democracy is informed citizenry. And it may not be so obvious now that we're experiencing this pandemic yet, but resilience of democracy and informed citizens, when there is, I'm not saying that there will be another pandemic, I hope not, but if there is another crisis of this nature that we have to deal with, then that's when the strength of resilient democracy and informed citizenship really rise and shine, because the civic society and the governments, different governments, are prepared to work around a different crisis. Authoritarian society may be able to control, may appear to control this pandemic more effectively, because basically the way to do it is not to go with the civic society. It's practically suppressing the civic society and cutting them off from lifelines or life sources and the economic activities. This is draconian. And sometimes it does work, but it cannot work forever and for a long time. So in that sense, I believe democracy is the answer, only because it is always adaptable. And the citizens who are informed through democratic institutions are always adaptable and can be always facing and working around another crisis. So again, for me, I think what is most important is that in democratic societies, we do have a choice, elections, but not just elections I think what is important is that each and every citizen have a freedom to choose responsibly. And this is where democracy really works. By opening up information, by sharing information, trials and errors, citizens are better informed, and citizens can make better choices more responsibly. In that sense, I believe democracy is the ultimate answer.
Thank you. And I think maybe I will just stay with you for a moment and we'll work our way back. What would you see as the main priorities of democratic governments, of democracies, but also with civil society in moving forward? What are the next steps we should be taking if we do have some degree that of perhaps hope or optimism that we're beginning to move forward from the last 2 years pandemic?
What I would like to see is that stronger partnership between private and public, because this is always a key to success to any responses to any crisis, not just a pandemic. And what this pandemic taught us was that the government cannot go alone, civic society could not go alone. But when we work together, when we are willing and ready to work together, then we can achieve more and better. So in that sense, we are also kind of looking back what we have done right, what we have done wrong. And civic society is now demanding much more active and much more extensive participation in policymaking and sharing information. Because, again, the best weapon against disinformation or even malinformation is more information. But more information provided in a right and proper way so that it'll reach the public as it is intended. And for that, authoritarian societies are not, or authoritarian governments are not equipped for information sharing. And you just, in businesses, you always have this very cold cost and benefit analysis. It may seem working now, but the cost is always hidden. And how much the society has to pay to continue with this such a draconian lockdown and draconian suppressive measures, you see only the outcome, but you don't see the cost. And this will only come out 5 years later, 10 years later, or even a generation later. But when we have all this balance sheet of cost and benefit, I'm sure what we see as almost chaotic developments and cooperation, or even like all these clamors in democratic societies, will turn out to be much more beneficial to the society and the generations to come, because we have learned lessons, and these lessons will stay with us, unlike those in authoritarian societies.
Thank you. And Ambassador Ramirez, I would ask you the same question. Perhaps I should restate slightly. But what do you see as the main priorities for civil society and democracies working together, let's say, to build back better from this pandemic?
I think the future is uncertain. We don't know what is going to happen. And the most important to face this uncertainty time is, I think, is through dialogue and cooperation. The civil society has their own role, and the government has their own. And through dialogue and to working together and through cooperation and looking what is the best way to deal with the consequence. There are some loss that is impossible to repair, the loss of life, and this count a lot. And The other problem that we are facing is the economic and the social impact of the COVID. And we have to face that and to bring solutions. And solutions come from cooperation, international cooperation among states. The virus has demonstrated that has not borders. We have to deal with this. And I always think, what is the future of the children, the most younger, the 3, 4, 5 children who are seeing people around them with masks and seeing around them restriction that for their age is hard to understand. And I think we have a lot of responsibility as adults to show for them a future world that is safe and is safe in the way that was safe for us at that age. We have a lot of challenges, but I think with the instrument of education, dialogue, and cooperation, and all together we can face that.
Thank you. And Ambassador Gogre, may I present the same question to you?
I think that the pandemic has reminded us that when we face challenges of this nature, which are unknown to start with, for example, we didn't know how long the pandemic would last, how infectious this virus was, and so on. In facing these kinds of challenges, the only way we can deal with them effectively is through a whole of society effort. And I would like to interpret the concept of civil society not only as organized civil society, but individual responsibility and individual engagement. That is, we all have rights, but we also have responsibilities as individuals and as citizens of a democracy. And those rights and responsibilities are not only exercised on election day, but every day. We have a right to get information, but we also have a responsibility to seek information, to be able to live in a responsible way, which is responsible not only to ourselves, but to our fellow citizens. That during a pandemic, which we don't know how long it will last, we cannot just ask for someone else to do the job. It is not in the nature of a democracy that citizens look to the government for solutions. We look to the government for leadership, but we also know that we as citizens have a responsibility to be part of the solution. And maybe I'm a bit optimistic, but I do think that the pandemic has reminded us of these responsibilities as citizens. And some of these responsibilities and some of the engagement take the form of organized civil society, and that is, of course, good. It's a vital part of any democracy to have a vibrant civil society. It is a vital part of any democracy to have a vital media, vital freedom of the press and vibrant media, because that is the way we can, as citizens, hold our representatives to account. It's part of the way democracies functions. I would even argue that without freedom of the media and freedom of the press, there cannot be a functioning democracy. So it's another of the strengths of democracies. But that is on the individual and national level. And I think another lesson that we have learned, I hope, is something that Minister Rao said in his introduction, namely that we need cooperation between countries on a regional and a global scale. Because a pandemic the virus does not recognize any borders. And the pandemic is global in nature. And we need a global effort to deal with it successfully, which we have been painfully reminded of as we have seen various variants of the virus emerge, most likely, according to those who know these things, because we have not reached the level of immunization and vaccination yet on a global scale. That is, we can reach a level of vaccination and immunization in a specific country, but since we live in a global society where we travel between countries, that is not enough. We need a global effort to support vaccination efforts globally, not only in our own countries. And that I see as one of the major challenges and tasks as we go ahead. Also in preparing for the next pandemic, which unfortunately experts seem to agree will happen at some time, that we then have an international framework in place based on the institutions that already exist, but that we are better prepared next time to deal with it on a global scale already from the start. Make sure that we have the necessary resources for preparedness, the necessary resources for research and development into vaccines, into medicines to deal with the effects of the next virus, and so on. And one can just hope that the effects of the pandemic in that sense will be lasting. That is, we will not forget about how unprepared we were, not only on a national level but also on an international level, so that we are better prepared next time. And I see this also as an important task for democracies, because again, this is part of the strength of democracies, that we are, I would argue, more legitimate and more effective, therefore, in dealing with challenges, and our societies will require from their representatives that then they not only take responsibility for the safety of their own populations, but also take efforts on an international level so that that safety is also ensured on an international level.
So I'd like to perhaps follow up a bit on those comments. The idea that the pandemic has shown us the need for there to be universal membership bodies such as the United Nations, democracies, non-democracies. Ambassador Ramirez, you talked about the need of a new multilateralism to look at these things. And certainly what we hope, as Ambassador Sun said, we don't see yet another pandemic anytime soon. There are other transnational, transglobal issues, climate disruption and others. I was wondering if perhaps any of you three would be willing to speak about the possibility of what is the place, what is the vision of democratic solidarity within multilateralism, which must go beyond its borders and beyond its ideologies to include all countries. I don't know if anyone would like to volunteer to speak first to that, or if I have to call on someone. But again, just this idea, what is the place for democracies in multilateral bodies which are not made up only of democracies when we're looking at these types of challenges? Ambassador Ramirez?
Well, first, I think that the multilateral bodies are democratic essentially, because all the countries, all the members are included, and all have the same rights and the same vote, except some of international bodies which are not mentioned, that is not so democratic because one country can represent a group of other countries. But anyway, I think there are a lot of organizations in every country that participate in this debate through ECOSOC, for instance. And this is one of the important body because include not only the member states, but the civil societies and a lot of groups. And there is a lot of international or multilateral events where the civil society takes have their own role. So in many of these occasions, we have gathering of the member states and also a gathering of NGOs that represent the civil society. And I think it's our responsibility, I think our responsibility as a citizen to help to build this bridge and to strengthen it, because the bridge already exists between in my view, between the civil society and among the civil society and the international body. And they provide a unique opportunity for a dialogue, for a different point of view, to reach a consensus, and in many cases, to speak with one voice.
Well, I absolutely agree with what Anna Maria just said, and I also would like to just add one more point, that this cooperation at a multinational level should also take place among the different civic societies as well, because again, governments have this pandemic showed us that even in the realm of life and death and healthcare and everybody's health and safety was concerned, and yet still even the pandemic was politicized, which is very sad, domestically, but also at an international level as well. So different governments have different interests and different values. So in that sense, I think at an international, at a multinational level, it's very important to work together with like-minded countries, those who share democratic values, but also rather than excluding and like pushing away others, but more inclusive way, how to encourage less democratic countries or those countries that are more leaning toward illiberal or less democracy or non-democracy, how can we encourage them to move toward? And in this sense, there was a very interesting report from IDEA from Sweden of last year, that they, until November of last year, they had a statistics of how many countries have moved away from democracy, how many countries have moved toward democracy during the pandemic. To our wonderful surprise, the conclusion was more countries moved toward democracy than moving away from democracy. And I think this is where we can also see the future of our cooperation at a multinational level. One, at, of course, government's level. We have to put down all this flickering and trying to compete, or petty competition of whose regime is better. We're dealing with universal life and death matter. And this is where countries can put down their own ego and their own sense of, I guess, or even arrogance, and have to work with each other. And this is where also COVAX, for instance, the more countries really should be committed to COVAX, and because again, the fourth wave showed us that without the rest of the world all fully vaccinated, it keeps coming back. And this time it is Omicron, but we already know that Omicron was not just from Africa. They were already somewhere around in different parts of the world. So again, that is at the multinational level, at the different institutions, organizations. but also among civic society. This is where we really have to work together with other civic organizations, other civil societies, to share our notes, so share our experiences, to share our best practices, and even including trials and errors. And without that, and that's the big part, at least 50% of when we say cooperation. So with that note, I think it's time that we should really strengthen the cooperation and this mechanism to cooperate and share our experiences at a civic society level as well.
I want to thank the panel for its very articulate presentations on your country's response to COVID, but also looking at larger issues of the international community and civil society's response. You've all presented some very interesting ideas as to what worked in your specific countries. Maybe just as we go now to close in just this final round, a lot of information has been shared today. Perhaps you might just speak in conclusion to what you saw as perhaps the most important lesson learned from the pandemic in terms of your country's resilience and your country's democracy. And Ambassador Gogre, perhaps we'll begin with you, and thank you so much for your participation today in the panel.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for this opportunity to take part in a discussion on a highly important topic. Well, there are a number of lessons to be learned, certainly. We have in Sweden, when there are national challenges of this kind, we have a tradition of appointing a national commission to sort of find out what really happened and what lessons we can learn. This commission is going to present its final report in the beginning of next year. There's been some reports already published by the commission, and some of the lessons are according to the commission, which I think is also widely recognized in Swedish society. Some conclusions are already there. We were not prepared when it comes to having stocks of protection gear, face masks, that kind of equipment for the healthcare sector, and more importantly for the staff of nursing homes and those who provide support for elderly in their homes. And the number of fatalities that we have unfortunately been noting, especially among elderly vulnerable groups, can, according to the findings of the Commission, be attributed to the fact that the staff did not have the proper protection gear in the very beginning of the pandemic. Of course, it was not known at the time how infectious this virus is and so on, but it is a fact that many people died, and probably many people died because of the lack of proper equipment. How do you ensure this? Well, one way is, of course, to build up enormous stocks of these supplies. That is one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is to ensure that you have supply chains that work. Those supply chains are, of course, global by nature. We come back to the fact that we did not, unfortunately, in the beginning of the pandemic, have naturally flowing supply chains of these and other items which were vital to deal successfully with the pandemic. So there is a lesson to be learned, but we don't know the answer yet. What is the proper answer? Another lesson, I think, is quite obvious, is that we have to be prepared for the unknown. We did not foresee this pandemic. It was foreseen that there would be a pandemic at some point, but of course we did not know when and of what nature. The conclusion is that we need to ensure that we have legislation in place already before the event takes place, that would ensure a swift and effective response. And I think in our case, although our efforts have been based mainly on voluntary observation of recommendations, there are certain areas where they also need to be a legislative basis for restrictions imposed by either the government or public authorities, which may perhaps have to be wider than we expected. Come back to the question of proportionality and to strike the right balance on one hand to ensure public safety, public health, and on the other hand to maintain guarantees for freedoms. But I think in our case there will probably be a debate on how legislation can be improved, not necessarily to be used in any situation, but in situations which are of a nature which require extraordinary measures. And I'm sure there will then be safeguards on under what conditions such legislation can be adopted and implemented. And the third, maybe a final lesson, what I said in my latest remark, I think the lesson is that we need more cooperation internationally. In our case, as a member of the European Union, I think we are going to have quite a number of lessons to learn and answers to provide on how we can ensure that what is an internal market with free flows of goods and services and people and capital needs to be a free-flowing internal market also in times of a pandemic. We saw how borders were closed, how supply chains were interrupted, even on a market which is without borders. I think here we have quite a lot of work to do in the EU, but also we, Sweden and the European Union, as partners in the global community, we need to ensure that we strengthen international cooperation so that we are better prepared next time.
Thank you. Very fascinating. Ambassador Ramirez, you presented many examples of your government's actions to protect its population. Is there any one particular lesson that you believe speaks to democratic resiliency in your country or in your region?
I think you talk about lesson learned. I think one of the lessons is that democracy is strong because government have to apply temporary and extraordinary measures. And the people understood that, and the people support that, and it was engaged. And that shows that their trust in democracy. And this is very important because nowadays we are seeing a lot of misinformation trying to undermine the credibility in democracy. And that was very important, that the reaction of the people. And the second lesson for me is the trust in science, because all the decisions taken was based in science, was in evidence. And again, there's a lot of misinformation around trying to undermine the trust on science. And you need to science, to believe in science, to believe in the scientific sector, to face these new challenges. We have the pandemic is one, climate change is another one, and it's a lot of events that concern to all the international society, where you have to believe in both things, in the evidence given by the science and also in the key role of democracy.
And Ambassador Sun, of the many interesting examples you provided, can you say one is the most important lesson learned or best practice to come from this experience?
I would quote again an axiom that if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go a long way, you go together. I think this is the lesson we learned at the national level, but also international level. Because after all, democracy is about inclusiveness and engaging the public, not excluding them. And that's where the chaos may come from, but this is also the strength of democracy or any democratic institution. By including people, by engaging people, by including all the stakeholders, you can have a chaos, but you can have very, I would say, messy picture. But if, after all, that's our life. So in that sense, democracy, I fully agree with Anna Maria that democracy is strong. But to keep it strong, we have to make sure that we will include people. We will include different sectors of society and as many stakeholders as possible. And that way, we can keep the society strong. We can also beat the pandemic. And this is, I think, the lesson of every country that had successfully controlled pandemic relatively compared to others are the ones where they have very strong democratic government. That, I think, is empirical evidence that some democratic governments may not have done as well as the others, but on the average, all strong democracies always fared better. Not just the pandemic, but with also climate change or every other crisis the humankind will have to go through, will experience in the future, or already experienced in the past. The pandemic also showed us that universal truth, that democracy, when it's strong, then we can deal with any crisis. Maybe not in the short term, but in the long run. I think that's the lesson that I'm taking from the pandemic.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador, and I wish to thank the entire panel for its very detailed, precise, articulate comments today. I also wish to thank the Foreign Ministry of Poland and Foreign Minister Rao for allowing us to present our thoughts as a community of democracies on this important issue. And I wish you all a good day, and thank you very much. Goodbye.
Ladies and gentlemen, and we are back. And after considering the role of countries and organizations in building back better, we want to explore ways in which civil society can contribute to the post-pandemic recovery. The second panel discussion with civil society analysts will be moderated by Mr. Łukasz Kulesa, representing the Polish Institute of International Affairs. Mr. Kulesa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and many thanks for this invitation, which was not just to me, but also to the Polish Institute of International Affairs, which was happy to again partner with the MFA for the Warsaw Dialogue for Democracy. Indeed, in the first session, the ambassador discussed the role of countries and international organization. In this session, we are looking at the state of civil society, the role of civil society, but also indirectly the state of democracy around the world. And by happy coincidence, we are meeting not only in the Human Rights Day, but also at the same time where the Summit for Democracy takes place virtually, but virtual hosting by the United States. So this is very much a week of democracy. Greetings to everyone who is watching us live, and by the wonders of technology, also greetings to those who will be rewatching this panel at a later date. The ongoing crisis has generated a number of challenges and threats to civil society. Restrictions of basic rights and freedoms, threats to the educational system, to the health system, of course, but also pressure with regards to disinformation, misinformation. It has also become to a number of authoritarian, semi-authoritarian countries an excuse, a basis for exploiting the situation to strengthen their position. But at the same time, it also generated unprecedented mobilization of the civil society. These were the times, and these are the times, when the activists in the words of one reports have shifted into a higher gear, and they remain on this higher gear. Sometimes, as we heard in the previous panel, they do it very much in close consultation, in close cooperation with states. Sometimes they do it in parallel with the state activities. But sometimes, in some instances, they do it actually in opposition or in conflict with some governmental structures. So this is a very complicated picture, and I hope that during this discussion, we will, of course, start with more general issues, but then we will go as much as possible to the ground level, to specific case studies, so that we avoid talking in generalities about democracy, civil society, and resilience. And to help us navigate this very complicated landscape, we have three excellent panelists, I would say representatives of civil society writ large, or very keen and very learned observers of developments in specific regions. So I would very briefly introduce them, and then we'll go to the discussion. Starting with Katarzyna Przybyła, who is the head of the Strategic Peace and Conflict Studies program at Collegium Civitas. She's also Director of Analysis and Senior Editor in the Analytical Center Politica Insight. And she's also doing her PhD in Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Manitoba in Canada. Her areas of interest include peace and conflict studies, nonviolent resistance, political violence, conflict analysis, but also American and Russian foreign policy, the situation in the former Soviet Union, critical thinking, analyzing, and writing. Katarzyna, it's good to have you here. Then to my left, Tomasz Żornaczuk, who is the head of the Central European Program at the Polish Institute of International Affairs, analysts and experts on Western Balkan, Central European countries, and also an expert on EU enlargement issues. And then next to him, Alexandr Papko, who is a journalist and political analyst working for the Eurasian States in Transition, or EAST Research Center, and also Bielsat TV here in Warsaw, but also in some remotely in Minsk. Let's put it like this. And Alexander's area of research are the European Neighborhood Policy, Eastern Partnership, of course, EU-Belarus relations, and writ large political, social, and economic transition in Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, other countries of the Eastern Partnership, disinformation and propaganda in the post-Soviet space. So we have a very good group of experts to tackle the issues in question. And let me start with a more general question. And please just very briefly state your case, and then of course we will go to more details. The question about how you actually perceive the impact of pandemic on the state of democracy, on civil society, and on its functionings. In your assessment, what were or what are the main new dangers and challenges that civil society and democracy faced, but also perhaps what has not changed, because not everything changed with the pandemic, and also perhaps is there any, I wouldn't say positive side, but are there any new opportunities for civil society, new openings that happen with the pandemic? So if I can ask Katarzyna to start with this round.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for giving me a chance to talk about the dark side and the bright side. Because you mentioned that this is a week of democracy, but I'm not so sure if this is the year of democracy. So let's start with the dark side. The dark side. Each and every conflict and the crisis is a test. It is a test for democracy, and it's a test for civil society. And it shows, most importantly, how we respond to the crisis. It shows what's the state, what's the condition of democracy. Do we hold on to our values? Do we still care about human rights? Do we care about law? Do we care about rules? So the dark side is that during current situation, because of coronavirus, lots of governments use the crisis to limit freedoms, to extend their powers, their strength. And let's be clear here, I'm not talking just about autocratic regimes. I'm talking also about democracies, because democracies are also using this chance, this occasion to impose restrictions to make some changes that directly affect civil society. So, for example, governments used this situation to limit freedom of media, to limit free speech, to freedom of assembly, human rights in general, to suppress the opponents, but also suppress civil society. And we were seeing growing numbers of incidents of political violence, both in autocratic regimes and in democracies. But also the governments use this occasion to challenge peace and stability, and we can see it in our region, but also even to attack other countries or talk about the threat of attacking. According to the Freedom House, and I think this is interesting when we talk about democracy, this is the 15th year in a row when the condition of democracy, the state of democracy, is worse than it was in a previous year. So maybe we have a week of democracy, but definitely not a year, not a decade of democracy. So that's the dark side of this situation. Now the bright side, because I don't want to say that there are lots of positives because of the current situation. You frame it opportunity. So yeah, definitely there is an opportunity here, because each and every crisis is also a chance for us to make positive changes. A crisis sometimes is showing us some dysfunctional structures that we tend to ignore, the structures that have been with us for many years, but we've been ignoring or we've been not noticing them. So a crisis is a chance for us to see them more clearly. And when we think about the good side of this crisis, I would say that this is the awakening of societies and civil society. Civil society raised to the challenges. And I guess that a wonderful example is Belarus. After the elections in 2020, people decided to say no to the regime. And even people protested, people who had never participated in a protest, people that were not interested in politics. They decided to say no. And what they did, they used nonviolent resistance. So probably my colleague will talk more about the case of Belarus. But I think that when we talk about the bright side or a chance or an opportunity, Belarusians were showing us that there are chances for positive changes. And what happened in Belarus, although there are lots of political reasons behind the protests, we can say that it happened also because of COVID, because of coronavirus. That's for the start.
Thank you very much. And let me now turn to Alexander. And as Katarzyna said, not everything started with the pandemic. And actually, in the region that you are focusing on, and we are all living in, we have faced increasing challenges to, let's say, from authoritarian states, from semi-authoritarian states, also in areas such as media freedom, freedom of assembly. So during the COVID pandemics, politics did not stop. Repressions continued, but also protest movements grow. Belarus was mentioned, but it also continued in Russia. I can also point out to Georgia, which is right now in yet another cycle of internal protests and counter-protests. So I would be interested in your general assessment, but also more specifically, how do you see this COVID factor affecting the situation in Belarus and in other countries that I mentioned? Also at the very tactical level, you're a journalist, so how does it affect the modes of the operation, the tactics of the operation? Please walk us through that as well.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to a large audience, and thank you very much for inviting me here. So first, I would start from a broader perspective, because I'm not only a journalist, but I'm a political scientist. And in general terms, in Eastern Europe, we witness the degradation of post-Soviet structures, economical structures, ideological structures. So all the infrastructure which was inherited by the semi-authoritarian and authoritarian regimes, and this infrastructure allowed them to keep the power. And after 25 years, we witness this wearing out of this old infrastructure, starting from gas and oil pipelines and electric connections to social changes, so the societies other, and the destruction of these old post-Soviet structures started in Ukraine about 10 years ago and produced a huge crisis, and the chain of crises is continuous, going on, and one of the how can I say, one of the links, one of these chains is in Belarus. So the crisis is quite long and it will continue, but COVID, it created, it sharpened the situation. So COVID produced, limited the resources of authoritarian regimes, and it made it more clear the distance between the society and the power. And what happened, for instance, in Russia, so let's start from Russia. A Russian government used these COVID pandemics as a pretext for unconstrained exercise of power. It allowed it to, COVID pandemics allowed the Russian government to make something impossible since the end of the Cold War. For instance, for several months they closed the borders for living, for citizens, their own citizens, leaving the country. So, like purely Soviet strategy. Also, Russia, China, other regimes tested surveillance software and hardware on their own citizens. So there are also obviously limits on freedom of speech and freedom of gathering. In Russia, we had so-called sanitary case when the supporters of Navalny are threatened to go to jail for organizing protests, which produce some threat to the health of the participants of this protest. So in Belarus, there was a myth that authoritarian regimes, since they're centralized, they can manage the situation better than democracies, which are weak, talkative, etc. So, but as we can see, the democratic regimes, due to their dialogue and close contact to the citizens, they manage the situation much better. And in Belarus, the regime tried to ignore this pandemic, and for several reasons. First, because the information from about the pandemic came from the West, and it was considered by the old aging post-Soviet authoritarian leaders as something like phantasm coming from another phantasm coming from the West. Second, they realized that the economic situation is bad, and the closing down, lockdown, so the slowing of the economy will be disastrous for the regime. And they acted completely in a way of Chernobyl catastrophe. So it was Chernobyl momentum for Lukashenko regime. They ignored the pandemic, which was obvious for people and which was threatening for people. So they were afraid, really. And it broke the trust completely, so broke the trust towards the authoritarian regime. Against the old background of the aging dictatorial system, aging infrastructure, power infrastructure, economic infrastructure, so and also again the background of the changes in the society and in the economy. So it was the last drop which produced an economic, social and political upheaval in Belarus. So the COVID was one of the most important factors, but what was not a decisive factor. So it just underlined, stressed all the conflicts which were within the system. And also what groups raised against this regime. Of course, there were young, educated people. Of course, it were also the people living in small towns with dying out economy. So this Soviet economy, which was degrading in last decades. And also as a professional group, medics, which were betrayed by the government, which were, how can I say, they just had to deal with the pandemic themselves. And the group solidarity crystallized among them, and also allows them for the first to be the first professional group raising their voice as a professional group. So now I explain the techniques of social upheaval in Belarus, and I will leave the chance to speak to others. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me now turn to Tomasz, and I would like to zoom in on the region that you specify in, which is the Balkans. And I think, as in other regions, both in Europe and more globally, actually it was hit by COVID, but it is a region that had already faced a number of challenges to democratic systems, to the operation of civil society. So if you could also say what has changed and what has not changed because of COVID, what are the elements of continuation and what are also the elements that have changed? Over to you.
Thank you, Łukasz. Thank you for that question. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel. The main observation would be that the pandemic has deepened the already existing vulnerabilities and weaknesses of the system of checks and balance in the Balkans. What are these weaknesses? We speak about the very weak partition of powers, pretty weak freedom of the media, quite numerous shortcomings in elections in many countries, including in the bigger one that is Serbia. Pretty high, one of the highest in Europe, rate of corruption and spread organized crime. So this is the conditions we were facing already before the pandemics. As Katarzyna said, not only authoritarian regimes, but also democracies were noticed that they have tendencies to abuse sometimes the powers on excuse of the pandemic. But this is not the case in the Balkans, because the Balkans are not democracies. They are only semi-democracies or half democracies, not full democracies, or hybrid regimes, if you like. On top of that, all of the countries are covered by the EU enlargement policy, and the pandemic came when this policy is in deep crisis. There was, without going into the details, there was a change of methodology, which was also connected to the blockade of the whole process of France. Then when this problem was solved, Bulgaria started to block the opening of negotiations with Albania and Macedonia, except for those countries that are not and that have not experienced the first intergovernmental conference on the enlargement yet. We have Serbia and Montenegro. Only those two countries are negotiating the membership with very little success, and of course Kosovo and Bosnia and Herzegovina being more or less nowhere in this process. So these are the general conditions. Now, as for the civil society. Of course, civil society, among other things, is to monitor and to report on those shortcomings that are seen in the actions of the government or state institutions. There is a general observation worldwide that the more shortcomings or the deeper the shortcomings are, the less eager is the government to cooperate with the civil society. In 2014, we have, at the Polish Institute of International Affairs, published a book on the civil society cooperation on the EU integration in the Western Balkans with the governments. So this is a book from 7 years ago, and one of the recommendations in this book is for the government, or any given government in the region, is to establish sustainable intersectoral consultations and monitoring bodies for public policies. 7 years on, this recommendation is still valid, so this has not changed much. As was already mentioned, just like every other crisis, this crisis of democracy in the Balkans and the crisis of pandemic as well opens a window of opportunity, including for the civil societies. And this comes also in the time when the European Union decides to support the civil society more, also in financial terms, including in the Western Balkans, when there is a new instrument under the Berlin process to strengthen the cooperation of the civil societies organizations in the Western Balkans. And if nothing else, there's also the new government coalition in Germany, which has in its declaration very strong commitment to strengthening the civil society. So those are the conditions that, of course, the civil society can make use of.
Thank you very much. Let me now again turn to Katarzyna, because I know that you also, in your research, look beyond Europe. And even though we started here, it's important that we try to move beyond our own neighborhood. So maybe I won't invite you to go continent by continent or country by country, but if you could tell us how much of this dynamics that you described previously, and I think there is a broad agreement within this panel about what are the challenges and what are the opportunities. How does it play out in other regions? How does it play out globally? Are there any places, any areas in which there are sharp differences, or is the situation or are the trends similar throughout the world?
That's a very good question. I think that peace building is never easy, because this is, my field of interest. It's never easy, and during the current situation, it's even more challenging. You need, or you want, concrete examples and concrete numbers. So I can give you, one number or one concrete example. And Yemen is a very good example of difficult situation during the epidemic, not only because of the epidemic. I mean, we should think about direct effects and also indirect effects of the epidemic. So I think it was few months ago, when the vice director of the World Food Programme announced that there are, and here's the number, 16 million of people in Yemen in the path to starvation. And it's not only because of COVID, it's also because of the lack of money at the international level, because countries were so occupied with fighting coronavirus that they, for example, decided to cut aid to other countries. So they were so focused on, COVID, coronavirus, restrictions, that you can say they almost forgot that there are other things going on. I mean, that there are conflicts on, each and every continent, that there are some hard problems to handle, like, famine, starvation, unemployment, difficult situation. So we just, focused on one very important issue, because I do feel that, the current epidemic, this is a serious issue. But we also have to think more holistically about the world. And Yemen is a great example. Another number, so countries were cutting aid to Yemen. And for example, I think The Guardian mentioned that the UK cut aid to Yemen by 60%. So now we know why we have such numbers. Obviously, the situation in Yemen is also connected to, the internal situation, conflict, etc. But during the epidemic, it was even harder for them, because they have to fight coronavirus, plus they have to deal with the lack of funding. And it was also true for the local peace building. There was an excellent conference and report done by the civil society platform for peace building and state building. And there were 2 reports presented, one by a good friend of mine, Christian Chito Chirigiri. He is from DRC. We studied together in the US. He visited Poland. But in his research with other authors, they were checking how COVID impacted local peace building. And the research shows that 4 out of 5 peace builders working on the ground experienced the reduction of funding. So how you can work on the ground. So we shouldn't just talk about the policy level, it's also about the grassroots level and the grassroots peace building. Because who is at the front row? These are the people on the ground. These are not policymakers. These are the grassroots level organizations. These are the local leaders. These are the local peace builders dealing with the situation on the ground. And with the lack of funding, with the often lack of interest, it was extremely hard for them to handle the situation and to deal with all the challenges. And the second issue, which I think is also extremely important, and I feel that I should talk about it because I'm privileged. Because I live in Poland, in Europe, in European Union, I was able to go to university. I am in this group that is privileged. So I would like to talk about marginalized groups. Because when we have a crisis, you know, we all suffer. But crisis hurts marginalized people more than others. Because it's, you know, it's hard for them on an everyday basis, but it's even harder during the crisis. And when we think about civil society, there's no civil society without the inclusion of the groups that are, you know, without their voice. People that are unprivileged or marginalized. And you know, we can talk about women that experienced a lot of hardships, lots of hardships during the epidemic because they were at the front row. They are responsible for care. They are often working in the hospitals. They are on the ground. But they were, for example, forced to leave their jobs, etc. We have people with disabilities, with people with health issues. We have minority groups. We have young people. Yesterday, I had a wonderful talk about youth and peace building. And a friend of mine, James, mentioned that the rates of, you know, suicides and young people committing suicides in the epidemic, the numbers are just shocking. But he said, you know, young people are saying that they do not see the future. There's like no hope for the future. But some of the groups, they even don't see the past. You want examples from, you know, other continents. So I don't know, US and Canada and indigenous people and First Nations. So these are the groups, you can say, without the past. Why? Because their history was deleted from the books, from the narratives. So these are, and imagine young people that are part of civil society. They do not see the future. They do not have the past. So how they can handle the present. So these are huge challenges, and of the examples from other countries that are true also to others, to our situation.
Thank you very much also for bringing this human face or human faces into our discussion, because it's always a danger that we talk in terms that are too abstract. For me, the question is whether the preoccupation of the governments on one issue and also international organization on international organizations on one issue creates a space that civil society, especially the international part of the civil society, if there is a thing like this, can try to fill in terms of financial resources, in terms of ability to act, in terms of interests. So, for example, how much of the aid humanitarian but also development aid can be provided by private actors, how much of the COVID vaccines can be provided by private actors. Some of them are stepping in, and we have also new initiatives about, let's say, vaccine distribution in less developed countries. But for me, it's a basic question whether we can expect the civil society to basically take over from the governments which have limited resources. But maybe that's something for the further discussion. Now I would like also to bring in Alexandre and appeal maybe to the political scientists in you, but also to the journalists in you, because I would like to talk about the issue of disinformation, propaganda, misinformation, which is used by malign actors worldwide, but it's also spreading, let's say, by the non-governmental actors, by the dark side of the civil society. And I want you to also, if you can reflect on how resilient do you think people and civil society were to these efforts, what worked, what didn't work in terms of countering disinformation, propaganda, COVID-related, but also other aspects.
Thank you. Let's start from the systemic things. The pandemic crisis showed that in different countries, about this 1/3 of the population is prone to some conspiracy theories, to disinformation, and it was a huge and striking discovery for many scientists, many politicians, and the level of people which are more inclined to believe in conspiracy theories is higher in the system where the people do not trust their governments. And it also have some correlation with the level of vaccination, for instance. We can see in the European Union, for instance, the higher level of vaccinations in the governments where these conflicts are less visible, where these conflicts are not so sharp, and we have these strong anti-vaccination movements in the countries where with weak trust towards political system, toward democracy. We can give an example of Estonia and Latvia, two countries where society are divided by ethnic lines, but the level of vaccination, for instance, in Estonia is much higher, and the situation is much more stable than in neighboring Latvia. Also, we can see that in countries like Ukraine and Belarus, the level of vaccination is very low, so pretty much identical, despite the economic system and political systems in Ukraine and Belarus are very different. What is in common? Long distrust toward the government. In Ukrainian case, it's a very long story. In Belarusian case, it's pretty much recent story, but the level of distrust toward the authorities is very high. So people refuse to obey to the orders of the political leaders, or they disobey, so they do not want to act as the political leaders want them to act, and it concerns also vaccination, unfortunately. What about disinformation? So here we see the broad picture of distrust toward the political system, which makes people believe in conspiracy theories, which makes people to refuse vaccination. And this is a huge subject which should be tackled in the future. So the governments, this is not only the case of authoritarian regime or semi-authoritarian regime, it's the case of democracies. So people should, government should talk to people, should be more inclusive, and make the citizens believe them. So if we speak about disinformation and misinformation, at the beginning of pandemics, it was massively used by Russia, so the country which likes very much such tool of external influence. So it's a weapon, basically. And at the beginning of pandemics, we could see a lot of materials about how the European countries are dying because of pandemics. Italy, France, how the protests in Western Europe are rising because those democratic systems are unable to tackle the pandemics. In contrast, the domestic authoritarian systems were shown as more solid, disciplined, and able to deal with pandemics. And when the mass deaths started in Russia, so all these rhetorics disappeared. And I wouldn't say so. I did not follow the studies on coronavirus misinformation last year, so I followed more or less them at the beginning. But in my opinion, in last year, this anti-vaccination rhetorics disappeared from Russian from pro-Kremlin media. But what they try. Where they try to play, it's divisions within the West, within the Western society. So the protests, some illogical, in the opinion of pro-Kremlin media, illogical limitation imposed on the Western societies by the governments. And also, if we look now at the channels like Russia Today, Sputnik, there is no one coherent message for Western countries. So in some cases, in some topics covered by Russia Today, so they say that vaccination in this country is good. In the other, the same situation is bad. So the same process made by different governments is maybe shown as positive or negative, but they just want to play on the division which exists, and these divisions are different in different countries. So you should not use a coherent approach to all the processes, just play on the divisions, and they do it. So yes, first, the pandemic show the internal division in the society, the huge problem of mistrust toward the governments, and also it may be used, and these divisions are used by the authoritarian regimes which want to weaken democracies. Thank you.
Thank you. And if I may follow the same pattern or the same direction of traveling with Tomasz and ask you how these issues are played out in Western Balkans, but maybe also in other European countries and regions. We discussed disinformation propaganda, but there is also all sorts of, let's say, vaccine diplomacy and the attempt, I would say, to seduce not just governments and leaders, but also civil society with these pictures of plane loads of vaccines, equipment being shipped in. I mean, we are doing it as a European Union towards our partners, but also we have Russia, we have China doing similar things. So if you could if you could discuss this a little bit more in the Balkan and European context.
Thank you, Łukasz. Indeed, there was a survey from about a year ago showing that roughly 75% of the inhabitants of the Western Balkan countries, let's remind them again, it's Bosnia-Herzegovina, it's Serbia, Montenegro, Kosovo, Albania, and North Macedonia. So 75% of people living there believed in conspiracy theories regarding the COVID pandemic, or in some significant elements of those conspiracy theories. Now, I'm not going to name them, we know all of them, but one pretty common is that is the West sometimes specifically the EU, sometimes specifically the USA, but basically the Western Europe, which includes Poland in this case as well. So Western Europe, European Union might be behind it. Now, in the countries where the, let's put it nicely, the commitment of the political elites to the democratization of their countries is not entirely seen, it's easy to do such judgments. And how we know it's the commitment to the EU, to the reforms, it's not explored or seen in these countries, where we see how long is the process of getting to the EU itself. But there's also something that was even highlighted or seen even better during this pandemics. That is precisely what you were mentioning about, Łukasz, the help and assistance related to COVID. And if we look how did, for example, the Serbian government, or especially the Serbian president, Aleksandar Vučić, acted towards this help, then the difference is huge and clearly visible. Namely, whenever there was any, or at least at the beginning, when there was help coming with masks or whatever equipment from China or from Russia, this was welcomed by the president himself at the airport, day or night. Whereas the European Union's assistance, which as in any other field is incomparably bigger than the one from China or Serbia, was barely covered in the state media. The state media that is very closely connected to the governing party, or most of any other media, since most of the media is connected to the governing party. So this again, possibly the pandemic not caused this kind of notions or judgments or behaviors, but it only highlighted how it impacted the stance or the position of those leaders towards the West. Of course, if you cannot explain why you don't yourself do the reforms, why you don't yourself democratize, and again, these are all semi-democracies, so there is things to transform, then you have to look for the external enemy, which is your partner, the European Union then.
Thank you very much. So far, even though some positive examples were mentioned, we very much discussed the dark side of the situation. But I would say let's move beyond the constructive criticism to constructive proposals as much as it's possible. So in short, my question to all of you would be, where do we go from here? There is this theme of building back better or building back differently, international system, regional system, our own countries, which sounds nice, and usually part of this effort is that everybody agrees that people should be involved more, that civil society should be integrated better in this effort. But then you look at the actual plans, and maybe inevitably it's mostly the administrations and the bureaucracies that are setting up goals, and then they are setting up implementation schedules. So it seems to me, at least, that for many countries and for many international organizations, they treat it as something too important to be left to civil society, because civil society is unpredictable and it doesn't have one voice. That's the interesting thing, that there are many voices and there are many expectations. Some of these expectations are actually at odds with each other. That's the beauty, but also that's the challenge when you want to ask the question what civil society wants. But I would turn to the panelists for their recommendations or their thoughts on how to build back differently, increasing the resilience of our democracies, improving our democracies, but also hopefully challenging the autocracies in the time that, in the period of history we are in. I mean, it's not a small thing to ask, but I'm sure our panelists are up to this task. And let me again start with Katarzyna.
So to start with, I'm very optimistic about the future. I mean, I do believe in people's power. And recent research showed that in the past 15 years, protests tripled. So people are active. And you said, you know, there is no one voice in civil society. Well, sometimes there's one voice in the government, and I'm not sure if this is a good thing. So in terms of recommendations, I would say that I have 3 recommendations. First is asking the question, what do you need? I mean, and I'm talking about the governments asking this question to civil society, because often they have wonderful plans, but these are their plans, and they do not consult the actions, initiatives with civil society. Civil society, people on the ground, they know what they need. So asking the question, what do you need? And, you know, we have the Summit for Democracy organized by President Biden, and I think it's, you know, good to talk, but it's best when we move from talks to actions. So active listening, that is something that is needed. The second is learning from the locals and learning from often also indigenous people. I mean, there is great wisdom and knowledge on the ground and at the grassroots level. And sometimes, you know, there are people without degrees or diplomas or certificates, but their knowledge is based on experience. So the second recommendation would be learn from the local civil society, from indigenous people. And the third recommendation, and it's huge because it's about supporting civil society, but you know, the biggest question is how to do it. So Erika Chenoweth and Maria Stefan, these are 2 authors that published a book on nonviolent resistance. And we know that nonviolent resistance is twice as effective as the violent ones. But recently, they published another book on external support, because there was this question, okay, so nonviolence is more effective, but how we can support from outside the movements. And for example, when we think about Belarus or Russia, this is the question of Polish government, how we support civil society in these countries. So the main conclusion was that what is best for the movements, nonviolent movements, is the support, but meaning trainings and workshops. So targeting certain groups and training them in nonviolent communication, nonviolent tools, in general, nonviolent resistance. This is the best tool. It's, you know, according to the research, it's based on 8 different examples from Europe and other countries. So this is what we should do. I mean, we have to be hard on politicians, but easy on people. And it talks about, you know, sanctions, good thing. But we have to be hard on the policy level, but very easy and very soft at the grassroots level. So that's my recommendation.
Thank you very much. 3 specific recommendations. I would now turn to Tomasz.
Thank you, Łukasz. I'll follow the pattern and give 3 recommendations. Maybe as well, subscribing to what you said, Katarzyna, supporting civil society, not only those on the national level in the biggest cities, when we stay in the Balkans, not only in Skopje, in Belgrade, in Tirana, but also on the local level. How important it is was clearly visible in recent months, and especially in last weeks in Serbia, when the subject of protection of nature, the environmental issues came or brought thousands of people to the streets. And this happens very often on the local level. This time it was about the lithium mine and areas outside of Belgrade, but this also shows that there is mobilization, there is motivations for the people to protest, to show, to stand up to their rights in on the local level in other communities than in the capitals only. So that would be one. If for the EU, if we think about the EU, I would maybe have two recommendations. One is the communication and the visibility of their actions. This is a notorious recommendation given by many experts, activists, and scientists regarding the EU assistance, the EU help, but also the soft power, also the technical assistance or expert assistance that is being given to the Western Balkans. The conclusion is that it's not only important to support by this means, but also to strengthen the visibility of that. If it's not possible by the media, which is in hands of the governments, then possibly some parts of civil society can do. And the third, or last but not least, be an example. To be an example for all those countries, for the EU as a whole, for all the member states who are in favor of enlarging the EU into the Western Balkans. It is extremely important to show good examples. If a country or a union as a whole requires reforms in the what was 23 and 24 chapters, that is the human rights, the rule of law, the judiciary system, and etc., then the more example itself it gives, and the more example is given by the member states, the more credible such recommendations and such requirements are. And I would stop here.
Thank you very much. Alexander, over to you.
Thank you much. I would totally support Katarzyna about her approach to the societies and the governments in Eastern Europe. I would just put in a lot of broader context. So in Ukraine in 2014 we experienced the beginning of the crisis of post-Soviet authoritarian regimes and produced a bloody war which is going on today. In Belarus this crisis just started last year. In Russia it will probably start in the years to come, but these are the main process of painful changes on post-Soviet area. So Soviet Union with its economy and society and ideology is dying completely, and what will rise on the ashes of the Soviet Union, it depends on us, it depends on the actions we do now. So as about Belarus, the EU countries should support the society and the new economy which is replacing this old post-Soviet one. The changes in Belarus, they are not only political, the processes are in Belarus, they are not only political, they are economic and social ones. So please support this new society, new economy, which is replacing authoritarian Lukashenko economy and his regime. As about Russia, please be prepared for comparable crises in the future and unpredictable acts of Putin regimes. They have much more resources, but their thinking is very, very distant from the reality. And so we experience a huge development in technologies, in social thinking around the world, and those people, they stay in 70s and they act more and more disconnected. Their acts are more and more disconnected from the reality, from the reasoning, logical reasoning. And as coming back to Belarus, now Belarus experiences the largest repression since Stalinist times. So please take it into consideration. It's completely a copy of Poland during martial law. But all the martial law will end one day, and it also depends first, what will happen next will depend on the links you produce with society of Belarus, which is against authoritarian regime and which seeks new future, and also the actions you produce towards authoritarian regime in Belarus, and also its main supporter, Russia. Like in communist times, Brezhnev was supporting military regime in Poland. So now it's pretty much the same with Putin and Lukashenko. But their time is over, and the crisis we have now, we are in the middle of this crisis. It will continue, and coronavirus pandemic just stressed the problems already existent, and these problems will develop, and so be prepared. Thank you much.
Thank you very much. We are almost coming to the end of this session, but before I'll say the final words of summary and thanks, I would like to go back to the panelists, not to restate their previous contributions, but I would like to ask you whether there is one, two things, if you can just select them, the things that we haven't discussed during this discussion, but you think are worth discussing in the light of the topics of today's Warsaw Dialogue for Democracy. We won't have time to go into actually discussing these themes, but I think it would be interesting to just signal them, just maybe to think about what we do the day after today, and also what could be the focus of next year's dialogue. And I suggest we start with Tomasz, then we'll go to Katarzyna, then to Alexandre. Tomek, over to you.
Thank you, Łukasz. Maybe then I'll point to, as you said, one or two questions, issues only. One, I think it is very important, and it was revealed by this pandemic, and it was already mentioned by Katarzyna. Mainly, it turned out that women were more affected socially and economically by the consequences of this pandemic. We had published an excellent piece on that at the Polish Institute of International Affairs a couple of years ago, and I think it's worth bringing to the light again, since I don't believe there is any democracy in the world that would question the need of a gender balance or equal rights for men and women, including in the international politics. So that would be point number one. And point number two is that it is important for democratic countries to observe how their neighbors, their partners, but also those who are more distantly geographically or ideologically or politically, how those countries behave during this pandemic, because this revealed some tendencies, this revealed some ambitions, not entirely democratic ambitions very often. So history taught us that crisis is something that is a common feature of any times. If not pandemic crisis, some other crisis will come, maybe even stronger ones than that one. It's important to learn the lessons and have good conclusions from that crisis that we go through now.
Thank you very much, Katarzyna. Over to you. You already mentioned a number of things, but
yeah,
I'm sure there.
I will try to be short. So my last comment would be about remembering. And there are two issues that I have in mind. First, remember about media and journalists. And I think the Nobel Peace Prize this year showed us that there is no peaceful society, peaceful world without independent journalists and journalism. And their work they are a danger. And they are doing their work with all the restrictions, dangerous, fears, etc. So when we think about civil society, we should not forget about journalists because they play an important role in civil society. And second, also about remembering, because I feel that we have a very short memory and we are searching for some answers and we are trying to figure out what to do, and we don't know the answers, but the answers are in the past. We just have a very short memory. And since we are in Poland, I would say, well, we have a great history of nonviolent resistance, and solidarity was one of the biggest nonviolent movements in the world. So, you know, if there is, I should give a piece of advice, it would be, you know, refresh your memory because the answers are out there.
Thank you very much, Alexander.
I'll probably say one last thing. Probably in the economic analysis in the years to come, we'll see that democratic regimes deal with pandemics much more efficiently than authoritarian ones. And in my opinion, this division between authoritarian regimes and democracy in next years will be more visible. So these conflicts will rise, and I predict quite more tensions in the years to come globally, in my opinion. So here we are at the summit, online summit of democracies, and probably democracies should prepare to harder world where there are much more conflicts with authoritarian regimes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We were given something that sounded like mission impossible, to try to tackle the topic that requires a long time and many voices to be heard in, I think, 1 hour and 35 minutes. But I suggest to those who are watching and listening that we managed to cover a broad range of issues. We tried to be as specific as possible. Inevitably, we focused mostly on European issues because this is where we are, but we are also trying to see what's going on outside of our continent. We also, or rather our excellent panelists, suggested some recommendations, and they might sound like common sense, but please believe me, sometimes common sense is being lost in all these documents that are being drafted, the higher level, sometimes the less common sense in these. So sometimes it's good to be reminded what we should do first, or you know, start with simple things before we go for very complicated ones. And this is a challenging year. Katarzyna said challenging decade or so for democracy, and COVID tested us, even adding to the challenges that we have already. But I'm happy that we didn't turn our heads from the challenges, threats, and bad things that happened, but we also identified a number of positive developments. Civil society is trying to be as strong as possible, is fighting back, is discovering new ways in which to organize itself at new areas where it has to step in, either with the governments or sometimes because the governments do not deliver. So I'm pretty encouraged with what our panelists had to say. So thank you very much to the speakers. And after a short break, I think we'll be back with our hosts, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the last segment of this year's dialogue. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, as we are approaching the end of the conference, I would like to invite the Deputy Director of the UN and Human Rights Department of the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Mariusz Lewicki, to provide closing remarks for the 9th edition of the Warsaw Dialogue for Democracy. Sir, you have the floor.
Excellencies, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, and all the participants online. As we are about to end the Warsaw Dialogue for Democracy 2021, I'd like to thank all our distinguished panelists for their thought-provoking and interesting intervention, and I wish also to thank all participants online, and we are very pleased that despite ongoing pandemic, this year we have managed to organize the Warsaw Dialogue for Democracy in a hybrid mode with at least panelists present in person. Dear participants, dear panelists, the Warsaw Dialogue for Democracy main idea from the very beginning has been to provide a platform for discussion on democracy. Platform for discussion on challenges that democracy is facing and how these challenges can be addressed. In that sense, COVID-19 epidemic is an enormous challenge, not only to democracy, because COVID-19 has an impact on every and each aspect of our life. And to summarize our discussion, and we have gathered, and we are also very happy that we have gathered representative of think tanks, of civil society, and also of diplomatic corps here in Warsaw. The best way to summarize today's discussion is that to address the challenges resulting from COVID-19 is to strengthen working together. Strength working together in the area of education and inclusiveness, and also cooperation with different stakeholders, which means the civil society, but also academia, think tanks, and also the governments, which are very much interested in promoting democracy. With these words, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to declare the Warsaw Dialogue for Democracy 2021 officially closed, and see you all in person next year at the Warsaw Dialogue for Democracy 2022. Thank you.